Spicer also said that if there is any evidence of contacts with Russia, then the Justice Department should investigate. And he denied that a probe was being discouraged.
So, Margaret, it seems pretty unusual that a news organization would be excluded from a White House press briefing.
Well, this was an off-camera gaggle, and 4 of the 5 main TV networks, with the exception of CNN, and many print reporters, with the exception of the New York Times, very notably, the 2 networks, or the 2 news organizations, I should say, who reported this story very aggressively in the past few days and came under fire from the White House, they were not included in the briefings. Now, you'd have to ask the White House on the exact reasons as to why they were turned away at the door. But CBS was pulled today, which meant it was our obligation to record and feed out the audio of that briefing. And so that has been distributed by CBS to all of the news organizations.
Can you tell people, there's a White House Correspondents Association that helps deal with this. How are they handling the situation?
Well, I know the head of the White House Correspondents Association, Jeff Mason of Reuters, his organization was in the room for this gaggle today. He has raised objections on behalf of the entire White House press corps as to how this was done, asking for some explanation as to who was chosen and who was not. Now, to be clear, in the past, there have been briefings where select reporters, either print reporters or select TV reporters, have been included and inviting. This is not specific to this White House. However, what is unusual about this is that it comes at a time when the 2 main news organizations who are vocally saying they were deliberately turned away, the New York Times and CNN, were the ones who originally reported the story that the White House is pushing back so hard on. So that raises some questions as to the motivation for turning them away.
Interesting point there. I do want to ask you, Margaret, to go back to the conversation between White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus and FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe. Do we know who contacted who about the New York Times story?
Well, what we know, according to White House officials here who briefed off camera, asking to be reported as White House officials, that is at their request, not have their names associated. What happened was Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, was meeting with the deputy director of the FBI. Following that meeting, this was at 7:30 in the morning, around February 14th or 15th, and was told afterwards that the deputy director of the FBI wanted to speak to him about another matter. And according to these White House officials, that issue raised was specifically the New York Times article about these reports of constant contact between the Trump campaign and Russian intelligence officials. Now, CBS News has not reported that story as such. What we have reported is that there was contact between Trump aides and Russians, some officials. So it's a nuance there, but it was actually reported in a way that certainly the White House believes was unfair to them. And the issue that was uncovered overnight was the fact that the FBI deputy director told the White House chief of staff that the story was inaccurate. The White House in turn said, please refute this publicly then, instead of just telling me privately, and the FBI declined to do that. The FBI is also declining to comment on the record right now about this story. So we are fully reliant on the White House's own account of exactly what happened. And as you heard in the story, Sean Spicer hit back pretty hard, saying, well, it's only natural for us to say, please refute this publicly. But there's some question as to whether that's White House interference in investigation or if that's White House pressure on public information. And of course, we heard from the White House, the spokesman, that he claims there's no investigation that he knows of underway.
Okay, lots of different pieces to that puzzle.
Yes.
There. I do want to ask, is the White House allowed to discuss possible investigations with intelligence agencies? And if not, would there be any repercussions for their conversation here?
There are firewalls here, particularly FBI officials are well aware of them. And it has been a practice of White Houses in the past, when they're communicating about issues, to say we don't want to interfere in an ongoing investigation and therefore decline to comment publicly on it. What the White House is saying is, on this matter, why they felt it was okay to discuss it and why they felt it's okay to go public with their account is that they say this was specific to the story that was published in the New York Times, not an investigation. So they're drawing a distinction there, saying that they are in the clear in terms of communicating about this. But as we know from our own CBS News reporting from our Jeff Pegues and his team, there are multiple probes into contact between Russian officials, Russians, and Trump aides, and that's not including the contact between the recently dismissed, I should say, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his conversations with the Russian ambassador.
I see. The president issued a new executive order Friday on regulatory reform. He says it directs each federal agency to form a task force to research regulations that are unnecessary and harm job creation. How is this being received?
Well, I was in the room in the Oval Office when the president signed that. He was surrounded by many very influential CEOs, the CEO of Dow Chemical and other big companies, and they all were applauding this decision to ask for a review because they are also being included in the decision making, or at least the information gathering process, and making recommendations to the White House on what they believe is a regulation that inhibits investment in the United States, that it's easier for a company to go invest in a country that has fewer, say, environmental regulations or fewer financial regulations than it is to keep jobs here. So this is another one of the type of executive orders the president has signed recently where it's ordering a review. It's not actually ordering a specific action. It's a consideration of future action, essentially. But the president has made clear that he believes regulation is an inhibition to investment in the United States, and he says he wants to make it easier to be able to keep jobs and money here.
Finally, Margaret, we were supposed to hear about this new travel ban executive order this week. It looks like it's now going to be next week. We also know that the president's going to address a joint session of Congress on Tuesday. What are you hearing from the administration about these two different things happening?
Well, we are hearing that 7 country-specific travel ban, the White House doesn't like calling it that, but this restriction on travel into the U.S. from those 7 Muslim-majority countries will be revisited next week. We're told the order itself has already been drafted and finalized, but the implementation and the rollout, the logistics of this, in essence, the White House says are still being delayed until next week. In the courts, there are still arguments going on, and this would help in some way, from my understanding, bypass that by trying to implement what the president's intent was here without having to take this to a higher court like the Supreme Court. But what the president wants to talk about and focus on next week is not the messy implementation of this or disagreement in the courts. He wants to talk about his agenda. When he goes before that joint session of Congress, it's going to be his vision of where he wants to take his legislative agenda, those things he needs Congress to help him with on tax reform, on health care reform. Remember that March deadline, mid-March, they have promised they'll deliver the plan to repeal and replace Obamacare, and that has become increasingly difficult and contentious of late. That's something we're going to hear the president speak a little bit about, probably not in too much detail, but at least his intent will be described there. And the White House says it's going to be a very positive message, underscoring a lot of what the president believes are his achievements so far. So this is going to be sort of a path forward from the president. It's not a State of the Union because he hasn't been in office long enough yet to really tell us where we are, but it's going to be a path forward.
Margaret Brennan, so much going on. Thank you so much at the White House for us today.